The morning Nora Paget discovered the door behind the wainscoting, she was on her knees scrubbing cold ash from the grate in the blue room, and the first pale light of a November dawn had barely troubled the drapes. She had been 4 weeks in service at Ashcroft Park. 4 weeks of learning which floorboards sang underfoot, and which fireplaces drew poorly, and which of the upper housemaids left her candle burning past the permitted hour. 4 weeks, too, of learning the particular weight of silence in a great house that had not been fully inhabited in 3 years. The park was 30 miles from Bath, set hard against a gray limestone hill, and the estate itself was managed on behalf of its lord by a steward named Mr. Clifton, who moved through the corridors with the brisk efficiency of a man who preferred the house empty and found the new Duke's imminent return an inconvenience. Nora had come to Ashcroft Park as a housemaid, having been formerly a parlour-maid in a household in Wiltshire where the master had died and the family dispersed. She was 23 years old, slight in frame but capable of a day's work that made the senior staff take note, and she had brought with her a small cedar box that held her father's last letter, a length of green ribbon worn smooth at the knot, and the habit of keeping her own counsel in a house not yet known to her. She found the door by accident. The ash bucket had caught on something at the base of the paneling, a section of wainscoting that did not meet the wall quite squarely, and when she pressed her palm flat against the wood to steady herself, the panel gave inward half an inch with a dry sigh, as though it had been waiting a long time for precisely that pressure. Nora sat back on her heels and stared at it. The gap was narrow, less than the width of her hand, and beyond it she could see nothing at all in the gray pre-dawn light. She did not push it further. She sat very still for a moment, listening to the house breathe around her, and then she closed the panel flush and finished clearing the grate, and said nothing to anyone. That evening at supper in the servants' hall, she learned that the late Duchess of Ashcroft had disappeared 3 years earlier, without explanation, farewell, or forwarding address. A footman named Gareth, who had been at Ashcroft Park since before the late Duke's death, said it in the offhand way of someone reporting old weather. The Duchess had been there one morning and gone by afternoon, and no one had seen her depart. He said it was a queer business, and that Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, still did not permit the subject at table, and then Mrs. Calloway arrived, and the subject died at once. Nora thought about the panel. She thought about it through the long, cold week that followed, through the turning out of the east guest rooms and the laying of fires in rooms sealed since the previous spring. She thought about it while she polished the silver under the watchful eye of the senior footman, and she thought about it during the hours she was permitted to herself in the evening, sitting near the kitchen fire with a small book she had brought from Wiltshire, its spine cracked from reading. The new Duke of Ashcroft was expected on the 14th of November, arriving from London with a party of 4. The house had been in a state of subdued urgency since the date was announced, and Mrs. Calloway moved through each room with a severity that made the parlour-maids address her only when spoken to. The blue room was to be made His Grace's private study. The east wing was to receive the party. The south gallery was to be opened for the first time in 3 years. It was while Nora was laying the fire in the south gallery, alone, that she went back to the panel. She did not intend to go further than the threshold. She told herself she was only satisfying herself that it was what she suspected, a priest-hole or a servant's passage, the kind of architectural relic common in old houses of this size. She pushed the panel, and it swung inward on silent hinges, and the passage beyond was narrow and very dark but dry, and on the stone floor just inside lay a lady's glove. Cream-colored kid leather, small, stitched at the wrist with pale green thread. The kind of glove a woman of quality would wear. Nora crouched, picked it up, turned it over. The cuff was dusty, but intact. The stitching had not rotted. 3 years, perhaps, or a little more. She stood very still in the dark mouth of the passage, the glove in her hand, and understood that she was now in possession of something she had not sought and did not know how to carry safely. She closed the panel. She put the glove in her apron pocket. She finished laying the fire and went back downstairs, her face composed, and she did not take the glove out again until she was alone in her room that night with the door bolted. She was not, by nature, a woman who courted trouble. Her father had been a schoolmaster in a Wiltshire village and had taught her, among other things, that the truth was rarely found by those who were looking for it, and frequently inconvenienced those on whom it arrived unasked. She had grown up knowing the difference between what could be said in a room and what could only be thought, and she had never mistaken the two. It was this quality, as much as her capable hands and quiet manner, that had made her useful in service, and it was this quality that now told her plainly that a glove found in a hidden passage in a house where a woman had vanished without explanation was not a small thing to have come upon. She folded the glove carefully and placed it at the bottom of her cedar box, beneath her father's letter. The Duke of Ashcroft arrived on the 14th of November in steady, cold rain. Nora was among the staff assembled in the entrance hall under Mrs. Calloway's direction, and she watched him come in from the wet as she watched most things, from a position that permitted observation without requiring it to be noticed. He was 34 years old, she guessed, though later she revised this to 36. Tall and lean, with dark brown hair gone slightly gray at the temple, and a face that had been assembled along severe lines, a strong jaw, and a direct set to the brow that suggested a man accustomed to arriving in rooms and having them rearrange themselves around him. His name was Edmund, the Duke of Ashcroft, and he had inherited the title and the estate following the death of his elder brother 2 years after the Duchess's disappearance. He wore a charcoal traveling coat, and his cravat was disarranged from the journey, and he did not look at the assembled servants the way men of rank often did, as one looks at furniture. He looked at each of them briefly, as though taking account of who was present. His gaze passed over Nora, and did not pause. She noted this. She noted, too, the way his attention moved through the entrance hall, touching the painted ceiling and the cold marble floor, and the uncovered portrait above the staircase, and the way his jaw set fractionally when it reached the portrait. A fraction only. Quickly controlled. The portrait was of a woman in pale gold. She was young and fair-haired, and was painted looking slightly away from the viewer, as though she had been caught mid-motion. Below it, on a small brass plate, the inscription read simply, "Catherine, Duchess of Ashcroft." Nora moved her attention back to the floor. The Duke's party was installed in the east wing by evening. At supper in the servants' hall, there was a notable increase in the urgency of whispered conversation, and Nora learned from the senior housemaid, a woman named Bess, who had a face like a tolerant walnut and 17 years of service at the park, that the Duke's mother, the Dowager Duchess, was expected to arrive within the week from her house in Bath. "Lady Ashcroft will not be pleased," Bess said, with a precision that carried entire volumes of unspoken history. "Not pleased at what?" Nora asked. Bess looked at her with the mild appraisal of a woman deciding how much to explain. "His Grace has brought a solicitor in his party," she said. "One Mr. Featherstone. He came only to deal with the Duchess's estate. To conclude it, as they say. To have her declared properly gone." Nora kept her hands folded and her face still. "And the Dowager disagrees?" "The Dowager," Bess said carefully, "has views on many things. She has had views on the subject of Catherine Ashcroft since the day the girl arrived as a bride. Whether those views have anything to do with legal proceedings is not a thing a sensible woman speculates about at table." She poured more tea, and the subject closed. That night, Nora took the glove out of the cedar box and turned it over again in the candlelight. 3 years. A woman gone without trace, without farewell, without witnesses. A passage that ran from the blue room into some further darkness Nora had not yet traced. A solicitor arrived to conclude the estate, a dowager with views. The glove was small enough to fit in the palm of one hand. She put it away again and blew out her candle. It was the 3rd day after the Duke's arrival that he came to the blue room to take possession of it as his study, and found Nora there attending to the fire. He stopped in the doorway. She turned, registered his presence, and rose from her position at the grate, her face composed and her hands clasped at her waist. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said. "I did not know you were expected just yet. I will finish later." "Stay," he said. The word was level, not unkind. He moved to the desk at the center of the room and stood for a moment looking out at the wet park. She returned to the grate and worked quietly. He said nothing for several minutes, and then he spoke. "You are new. I have been here 4 weeks, Your Grace." "Where before?" "A household in Wiltshire, Your Grace." The family dispersed. He was silent again. She had nearly finished when he spoke once more. "What is your name?" "Paget, Your Grace." "Nora Paget." He did not reply. She finished the grate, gathered her tools, and moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused, without knowing quite why she paused. Some instinct that was not calculation. "Your Grace," she said, her back still partly toward him. "The wainscoting in this room. There is a section, behind the 3rd panel from the south window, that is not properly sealed. It may want attention before the winter." She heard the quality of his silence change. "In what way?" he said. "Not properly sealed." "It opens, Your Grace." "Inward." She did not turn around. "I noticed it while attending the grate. I expect it is a passage of some kind. Common in houses of this age." She heard him cross the room in several deliberate strides. She stepped back from the threshold and turned. He had crouched at the panel and pressed his hand to it, and the panel swung inward, and she watched his face very carefully at that moment. His jaw set. His hand remained flat against the wood for a count of perhaps 3. Then he straightened and turned and looked at her directly for the first time. "You found this yourself?" he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "When?" "On my 2nd morning here." Another silence. His eyes were gray-green and held nothing she could readily name, which was itself a kind of information. "And you told no one?" he said. "No, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Why are you telling me now?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it for 3 days and had arrived at the only answer that was honest. "Because it seemed to me that you were the person it belonged to," she said. Something shifted in his face. Barely perceptible, the kind of shift that was less an expression than the faint movement of weather behind clouds. He nodded once, slowly. "Leave it," he said, "and say nothing to anyone." "Yes, Your Grace." She left the room. If you have ever found something that was not yours and not yet anyone's, and felt the particular weight of that, stay close. This story belongs to that feeling. Nora said nothing. She went about her duties that day and the following day, as she always did, and she watched without appearing to watch. She noticed that the Duke went to the blue room alone after supper, and that he stayed for some time, and that when Mr. Clifton came looking for him, the steward was told he was not to be disturbed. She noticed that the solicitor, Mr. Featherstone, took meals alone in the east wing, and emerged each morning with a leather satchel pressed tight under his arm. She noticed that the portrait of Catherine Ashcroft had been covered with a length of Holland cloth sometime during that first week, and that no one seemed to have been instructed to do so. The Dowager Duchess arrived on the 19th of November, 4 days after her announced date, which Bess said was itself a statement of a kind. She was 61 years old and carried her rank the way certain women carry a garment they have worn so long it has shaped itself to their body. Her name was Augustina, and she moved through the house with the quality of ownership that had nothing to do with legal title and everything to do with long habit. She met Nora on the morning of her second day, in the corridor outside the morning room, where Nora was carrying a coal scuttle. The Dowager looked at her with pale eyes that were brisk and assessing, and arrived at their conclusion in approximately 2 seconds. "You are the new housemaid," she said. "Yes, my lady." "You came from Wiltshire, I am told." "Yes, my lady." "A girl from the country," the Dowager said, to no one in particular. "How very provincial." She passed on without another word. Bess, who had been just out of sight around the corner and had heard every syllable, appeared at Nora's side and gave her a look that was equal parts apology and warning. "She is the same to everyone she considers beneath consideration," Bess said quietly. "The trick is not to take the bait." "I did not intend to," Nora said. She had not, in truth, felt the sting of it with particular force. She had been called worse things by people she respected less. What she noted instead was the manner of it, the reflex of it, the way the Dowager had taken the measure of her and named her diminished, before either of them had spoken more than a syllable. She noted this, and placed it alongside other things she had noted, and the arrangement grew interesting. The arrangement grew more interesting still the following morning, when she was passing the closed door of the library and heard, through the heavy oak, the Dowager's voice and the Duke's voice, and paused only long enough to catch a single exchange. "There is nothing to be found," the Dowager said. "There never was." "Then you will have no objection to Featherstone's process," the Duke said. A silence. Then the Dowager said, "She was not a well woman, Edmund. You know what she was." "I know what you told me she was," he said. "Which is not the same thing." Nora moved on. She went directly to the east wing and knocked at Mr. Featherstone's door, which she had never done before, and which she did not allow herself to think too carefully about before she did it. He opened the door himself. He was a small, precise man with spectacles and an expression of permanent, mild concentration. He looked at her with surprise, and then with the suspended judgment of a careful man, encountering something unexpected. "I beg your pardon," Nora said. "I am Paget, one of the housemaids. I have something I believe you need to know about." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." She told him about the passage. She told him about the glove. She told him where she had found it, and when and what she had done with it since. She did not tell him what she had heard at the library door, because that was hearsay and not evidence, and she had learned from her father that the difference between the two was the distance between a true thing and a dangerous one. Mr. Featherstone sat very still while she spoke, and when she had finished he removed his spectacles and cleaned them carefully with a small cloth from his breast pocket. "Where is the glove now?" he said. "In my room? I can bring it." "Do so," he said, "and tell no one else." She brought it that afternoon, and he placed it on his desk beside several other documents she was not able to read at the angle she stood. He looked at the small cream-colored thing for a moment, and then he looked up at her with an expression she could not entirely decipher. Something that was partly calculation and partly something older and less comfortable. "The passage," he said. "Where does it go?" "I did not trace it fully," she said. "I stopped at the first turning." "Could you trace it now?" She considered. "Yes," she said. "Tonight, then." Bring a candle." She was not, by any measure of the word, reckless. She understood that she was taking a step that would be consequential and possibly irreversible, and she understood that the reason she was taking it had something to do with the weight of the small cedar box and the letter inside it, and with the habit her father had given her of naming a thing for what it was, even when naming it was inconvenient. A woman had vanished. A glove had waited in the dark. The truth did not go away because it had been declared properly gone. She brought the candle that night at 10. The passage was longer than she had reckoned. It ran behind the east face of the blue room, then turned south, and narrowed to the width of a single person moving sideways, then widened again at a second door, this one locked. The lock was old, a simple barrel of the kind that could be managed with a bent wire if one knew what one was about, and Mr. Featherstone, who had come prepared, managed it in under a minute. Beyond the second door was a small room. It had clearly been a steward's closet at some point, long converted to other uses. There was a narrow pallet, a writing table, and on the writing table a sealed leather satchel, dusty with 3 years of undisturbed air, and beside it a pair of kid leather gloves, cream-colored, stitched at the wrist with pale green thread, the pair to the one Nora had found in the passage. Mr. Featherstone looked at the satchel for a long moment without touching it. "She meant to come back for it," he said quietly. "Or she left it so someone would find it," Nora said. He looked at her then with the expression of a man revising his estimate of a thing. He picked up the satchel and opened it, and inside were letters. Many letters, written in a hand that grew increasingly urgent across their dates, addressed to a solicitor in Bristol whose name Nora did not recognize, and containing, as she was able to see in the few lines, Mr. Featherstone permitted her to observe a woman's account of a situation that had become untenable and of steps she was taking to address it through proper legal channels before she could no longer be certain of her liberty to do so. The satchel had never reached Bristol. The next morning, Nora was summoned to the Duke's study. She had expected this. She had not slept, and she had spent the hours of the night ordering what she knew and what she did not know, and what she could answer for. She came to the blue room with her hands folded and her face composed, and found the Duke standing at the window with his back to her, and Mr. Featherstone seated at the desk with the open satchel, and a cold, perfectly sustained quality of silence in the room that she felt against her skin, like a change in weather. The Duke turned. He was pale under his usual composure, and his jaw was set in the way she had seen at the panel, that fractional hardness that was not anger, but something older and less freely expressed. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He did not sit. He stood for a moment looking at her, and she looked back without flinching, which she could see registered in some small way by the stillness of his gaze. "Featherstone tells me you found the passage weeks ago," he said, "and said nothing until 3 days ago." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why did you wait 3 days after telling me before going to Featherstone?" It was a precise question and deserved a precise answer. "Because I was not certain what you intended to do with what I had told you," she said. "I waited to see." A silence. "And what did you conclude?" "That you intended to know the truth," she said. "Not merely to confirm what you had already been told." His jaw moved. His gaze did not leave her face. "What had you been told?" "Nothing, Your Grace. I arrived after. A house remembers what has happened in it, and I have learned to listen to houses." She heard Mr. Featherstone shift slightly in his chair, and thought that this might have been a step too far toward the declarative. She kept her face plain and waited. The Duke said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "She was not what my mother told me she was." Nora did not reply. It was not a question. He crossed to the fireplace and stood with one hand against the mantel, looking down at the cold grate. She was attempting to leave. Legally. With the means to support herself. The letters are to a solicitor she had engaged in Bristol on her own initiative, through a former schoolfellow, without my mother's knowledge. He paused. She never arrived. She is gone then, Nora said. Not declared gone. Actually gone. We believe so. The Bristol solicitor has confirmed she never arrived. Featherstone is pursuing what remains of the correspondence through other channels. His voice was level, its control exact, the kind of control that had been built over years. She died before she could be helped. Nora was quiet for a moment. I am sorry, she said. He looked up from the grate. The gray-green eyes held something she recognized as grief, clear and specific, and not newly acquired, but long carried. She deserved better than what this house gave her, he said. He had not said it to Nora in particular. He had said it to the room, to the cold grate, to the years between. She understood this and did not intrude upon it. Mr. Featherstone cleared his throat gently. There is the matter of the dowager, he said. The Duke straightened. His face returned to its customary arrangement, and he looked at Nora once more. You are to say nothing, he said. Not yet. Not until Featherstone has spoken to her directly, with the satchel. Yes, Your Grace. Stay in the house. I may need you as a witness to where and when you found the glove. Yes, Your Grace. He looked at her for a moment, and she thought he was about to dismiss her, when he said, with a slight alteration in register, that she could not have described precisely. You took a considerable risk, coming to Featherstone, he said. I did not think it was a risk I could decline, she said. Something almost perceptible moved in his face. No, he said after a moment. I expect not. She left the room. The conversation between the Duke and his mother took place the following afternoon in the library. Nora was not present. She knew it was occurring because she could hear, from the corridor, the quality of silence that sometimes precedes the end of a long argument, and because Bess appeared in the servants' hall shortly after, with the expression of a woman who has understood something she cannot say aloud. The dowager's maid began packing trunks that evening. There was to be a small gathering at the park on the 22nd of November. 4 families who had been in correspondence with the steward and were to dine before the house closed again for the winter. Nora had understood that the gathering was formal and that the household would be on its best footing. She had not understood until the morning of the 22nd that the dowager intended to come to dinner despite having packed her trunks. She understood this when she was carrying fresh linen to the east guest rooms and heard the dowager's voice in the corridor below, speaking to Mrs. Calloway. The new housemaid, the dowager said. The country girl. It was she who went ferreting in places she had no business, was it not? Mrs. Calloway's reply was not audible to Nora, but its tone was carefully neutral. A servant who involves herself in family affairs, the dowager said, is not a servant who can remain in this house. You may tell her so at your convenience. Nora stood in the corridor with the linen in her arms and allowed the information to settle. She was not afraid, precisely. She was something more specific than afraid, a cold, clear understanding of what was now at stake for her and what was not, and what she would do about each. She had no claim on this house. She had 4 weeks of wages and a cedar box, and the clothes on her back and the ability to find another position if she needed to. She had also found a glove in a passage and carried it carefully for weeks and placed it in the hands of the person she had judged most likely to use it correctly. That had been the right thing to do. She was still certain of it. The dowager's opinion of that fact did not alter it. She finished delivering the linen and went back to her duties and said nothing to anyone. The dinner on the 22nd was set for 8 o'clock. The guests arrived at 7, 4 families of comfortable Regency quality, and the drawing room was opened, and the fires were well stocked, and the candlelight was warm across the portrait of Catherine Ashcroft, which the Duke had uncovered that afternoon with his own hands. Bess reported, though quietly and without ceremony. Nora was serving at table. She had not expected to be, but the senior footman was taken ill in the afternoon, and Mrs. Calloway made the assignments briskly and without sentiment. Nora had served at table in Wiltshire and knew the forms. The dowager sat at the Duke's right hand, as was proper. She was composed and gracious and managed the conversation with the ease of long practice. She looked, across the length of the table, at Nora exactly once, and the look was brief and very clear, and said, without any words at all, that the matter was not concluded. The Duke did not look at Nora at all. He spoke to his guests with the measured attention of a host who has learned through long habit to be present without revealing where he is. It was after the third course, during a brief movement of the conversation toward the northern estates and their winter prospects, that Lady Dunstable, a handsome woman of 50 with sharp good humor, said something that caused the dowager to angle her fan in Nora's direction with the small precision of a woman who has found her moment. "I understand your household has been unsettled lately, Your Grace," Lady Dunstable said pleasantly. "Some business with a passage, I was told in Bath." The table's attention shifted, that faint collective movement of ears that a drawing room makes when something interesting surfaces. The dowager said, smoothly, "A maid found a passage she had no business finding. One of those country girls who cannot resist putting their noses where they do not belong." She touched her fan to the tablecloth once, lightly. "It is the sort of thing that disrupts a household. One hopes His Grace will address it." She had not looked at Nora. She looked at the candelabra. The table was quiet. Nora stood at her station along the wall, her hands at her sides, her face perfectly still. She was aware of the warmth of the room and the smell of the candles, and the fact that her pulse was quite steady, steadier than she had expected. She was aware, too, of the Duke's stillness at the head of the table. The particular quality of it that she had learned in the past week to read as the stillness that precedes decision, rather than the stillness that precedes withdrawal. He set down his wineglass. "Paget," he said. She took one step forward. "Your Grace." He looked at her directly, and the room with him, every face, in the warm light of the candles. "The passage you found," he said, "and the leather satchel, and the correspondence within it. You brought these things to Featherstone at considerable risk to your own position." "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "Because you believed the truth of them outweighed the inconvenience," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." The silence in the room was the held kind, the kind that forms when a gathering understands that something is being made irrevocable in front of them. The Duke said, "Miss Paget found evidence of a woman no one had looked for. This house owes her a debt it cannot repay." He said it to the table. He said it clearly and without emphasis, the way a man states the correction of a record in a room that has been given false information for a long time. The dowager's fan went still. Lady Dunstable looked between the Duke and Nora with the expression of a woman who has just been handed a much better story than the one she arrived with. Bess, who was stationed near the sideboard and who had 17 years of practice not reacting to things, very nearly reacted. The dowager said nothing. Her face had not lost its composure exactly, but it had lost its confidence, that small, precise degree by which composure and confidence are two separate things, and the room could see the difference. Nora stood very still and allowed the moment to be what it was, and did not look triumphant, because she was not. She was something quieter than that, something she did not have an immediate name for. The Duke's gaze rested on her face for a moment longer. Then he reached for his glass, and the meal resumed, and the conversation moved elsewhere, as conversations do, and the Dowager spoke no more of country girls or passages for the remainder of the evening. The Dowager left Ashcroft Park on the morning of the 24th. Her trunks had been packed since the evening of the library conversation, and she departed with perfect civility, which was its own kind of acknowledgment, and without the speech she had clearly prepared about servants and their stations and the proper order of a well-run household. She did not speak to Nora directly. She did not need to. Bess watched the carriage leave from the upper corridor window. "She will be back in the spring," she said, without heat, with a new theory. "Perhaps," Nora said. "She always has a new theory," Bess said. "It is her principal occupation." Nora said nothing. She went back to her work. She did not speak to the Duke for 3 days after the dinner. He was occupied with Mr. Featherstone and the legal proceedings, and the house was busy with the aftermath of the gathering and the winter preparations. And Nora went about the Blue Room and the South Gallery and the East Guest Rooms in the ordinary way of her duties, and did not seek any occasion she had not been given. On the 4th day, the 27th of November, she was in the Blue Room early, banking the fire for the morning, when she heard his footstep in the corridor, and then at the door. And he entered, and found her there as he had found her on that first morning, on her knees at the grate. She rose and turned, and he was already looking at her. "I did not thank you," he said. His voice was quiet, its quality direct, and without the customary protective distance. "I should have done so before now." "There is no need, Your Grace." "There is," he said. He crossed the room to the window. Not away from her, but to the window that looked out over the park. The gray November morning. She had been attempting for 2 years to leave through proper means. The correspondence began before my brother died. No one in this house permitted her to succeed. He said it plainly, without apology and without self-exoneration, the way a man states the truth of his own failure when he has lived long enough with it to name it clearly. Nora said nothing. She waited. "I knew she was not well treated," he said. "I did not know how much I had not known." He paused. "That is a distinction that matters to me, perhaps only to me." "It matters," Nora said. He looked back at her. In the gray morning light, his face was without its customary management, not unguarded exactly, but open in the way a room is open when its shutters are taken down after a long winter. She felt the warmth in her throat that she had been keeping at a careful distance for 3 weeks, the warmth that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the specific quality of a man who looked at a thing and named it honestly, who did not prefer the convenient story to the one that was true. "You are not going to remain a housemaid," he said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You have the quality of a woman who was not born to this position. I do not say that as a criticism." He paused. "Your father was a schoolmaster." "Yes, Your Grace." "You read. The book you carry has been read many times. You observed things in this house that members of my own staff did not observe, or observed, and did not act upon." She was quiet for a moment. "There are many women who observe things and have nowhere to carry what they have observed," she said. He turned fully from the window and faced her. The gray-green eyes held the same quality she had seen on the morning at the panel, that undeciphered weather, except that now she stood closer to it and could name one element of it, that it was the look of a man who had been watching her watch him for longer than she had known. "I would ask you to stay," he said. "Not as a housemaid." Her heart performed a specific action that she noted and did not permit her face to record. "In what capacity, Your Grace?" she said carefully. A silence. His jaw shifted slightly. "That is not yet entirely clear to me," he said, "which is itself a circumstance I am not accustomed to." She could feel the warmth in her face now and did nothing to prevent it. "Nor I," she said quietly. He took one step toward her, a single step, and stopped. He was close enough that she could see the fine gray threading at his temple and the faint line at the corner of his mouth that came from years of careful control. "Your name," he said. "Your given name." "Nora," she said. "Nora," he said, as though he were setting it in a place he intended to keep. Then, after a pause, so quietly it was almost only breath, "Stay." She did not answer immediately. She looked at his face, which was the honest face of a man who had found something he had not expected to find, and was asking her to trust him with what that meant. And she thought of her father's letter in the cedar box, and the green ribbon worn smooth at the knot, and the small weight of the glove she had carried for 3 weeks through a house full of things that had been kept in the wrong order. "Yes," she said. What followed was not the work of a single conversation or a single week. It was the work of a winter, and it was the finest kind of work, because it was willing and attentive on both sides, the kind of work that two people do when they have each decided the other is worth the difficulty. By December, the Duke had arranged for Nora to serve as a personal secretary, a position of ambiguous definition that Mrs. Calloway accepted with the smooth adaptability of a woman who had seen stranger things in 30 years of service and intended to see stranger things still. The position required Nora to be present in the Blue Room during the Duke's working mornings, to manage his correspondence under his instruction, and to be treated, in these hours, as a person of consequence rather than of service. She found this arrangement required more adjustment than she had expected, not because she doubted herself, but because being seen clearly by a person of intelligence and directness after years of being overlooked produced in the body a kind of stunned warmth, as though a room long kept dark had had its shutters drawn back too quickly for the eyes to manage. The Duke did not press her. He was a patient man in the ways that counted, and his patience had the quality of steadiness rather than of withholding, so that when he was near her at the writing table, and their hands came close over a document, or when he spoke her given name in the low, deliberate way that was different from every other way he spoke, or when he turned from the window to find her eyes already on him, there was no discomfort in the moment, only that held warmth and the knowledge that they were both fully present to it. She told him about the cedar box in January, on a morning when snow had shut the park, and the world outside the Blue Room windows was a simple white. She had brought it with her, without planning to, setting it on the corner of the writing table. And he had looked at it, and then at her, with a question in his face. She opened it. She showed him the letter. She showed him the ribbon, worn smooth at the knot from years of being held and then released. "My father," she said. "He died 2 years ago. He wrote this the winter before, when he knew." He read the letter with care, and she watched his face, and what she saw in it was attention, the specific, deliberate attention he gave to things he had decided deserved to be seen accurately, and she felt the warmth in her throat go deep and steady. "He knew what you were," the Duke said, returning the letter. "He knew what he had made," she said. "That is different." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, a single deliberate gesture, warm and unhurried. She turned her hand over and held his. By February, no one in the house spoke of her as the country girl from Wiltshire. By March, Mr. Featherstone had returned from Bristol with the final documentation of Catherine Ashcroft's legal correspondence and the confirmation, after long inquiry, that she had died of a fever in a coaching inn in Gloucestershire in the autumn of the year she left, having been turned back from Bristol by a man in the Dowager's employ who had intercepted her intended journey. The documentation was placed in the proper legal record. The Duke received it in the Blue Room, alone, and Nora left him to it, understanding the nature of the grief that required no witness. She came to him 2 hours later with a cup of tea, which she set on the table near his hand without speaking. And he looked up at her, and did not speak either. And that, too, was a kind of knowing. He proposed to her in the South Gallery on the last day of March, standing before the small panel that had stood open since November, the passage no longer secret, and the passage no longer needed. He asked her in the direct and level way he asked everything that mattered to him, using her given name at the start of the question and at its end, and she said yes in the same quiet manner, and they stood for a moment in the late winter light of the gallery, his hand holding her hand, and the house around them was warm and still and settled, the way a house is when it has been restored to its proper use. There was a small ceremony in April at the parish church in the village below the park, with Mr. Featherstone and Bess and the vicar's wife and the senior housemaid in attendance, and a single coach on the gravel, and the pale early light of spring coming through the old stone windows and finding everything it needed to find. That evening they came back to Ashcroft Park in the late afternoon, and the house received them as a house receives people who belong to it, with warmth already laid in the fires and the smell of the kitchens, and the particular quiet of rooms that have been waiting with patience for a long time. Nora went first to her room, which was no longer her room, and took her cedar box from the shelf where she had kept it. She carried it to the Blue Room and placed it on the writing table, beside the vase of early narcissus the cook's daughter had cut from the kitchen garden that morning. She opened the box and took out the length of green ribbon, worn smooth at the knot from years of being held and released, and she set it down in the light. Edmund came in behind her. He stood at her shoulder and looked at the ribbon on the table. She had carried it for so long that her hands knew the smooth weight of it the way hands know the things they have held in the dark, by feel alone, without having to see. She left it on the table. She did not need to carry it anymore. If this story stayed with you, carry it a little longer before you let it go. It was made for the quiet hour.